My name is Catherine Beaumont, and I write this account from a place of safety. Though the memories of what transpired still haunt me like the humid Louisiana heat that never truly leaves your skin, it was the spring of 1845 when my life took a turn I never could have imagined. When I learned that sometimes the most unexpected alliances are forged in the crucible of desperation. The morning Uncle Cornelius informed me of the arrangement, I was sitting in our shabby parlor in New Orleans, mending a dress that had seen far too many repairs. The Beaumont family fortune had crumbled with my father's death 2 years prior, his shipping business destroyed by a series of bad investments and outstanding debts that seemed to multiply like mosquitoes in the swamp. "Catherine, dear child," Uncle Cornelius said, his voice carrying that false sweetness that always preceded his most unreasonable demands. He was a thin man with calculating eyes, who had assumed guardianship of me, more out of obligation than affection. "I have wonderful news. Mr. Jemiah Blackwood has agreed to take you as his wife." I nearly dropped my needle. "Mr. Blackwood, but I've never even met the man properly." "He's seen you at church, child. A successful sugar planter with over 200 slaves and thousands of acres along the Mississippi. You should be grateful for such a generous offer." His tone grew stern, especially considering our circumstances. Our circumstances, a delicate way of saying we were nearly destitute, living on the charity of distant relatives and the remnants of my mother's jewelry, which had been sold piece by piece to keep food on our table. I was 19 years old, considered by many to be approaching spinsterhood, in a society where girls married at 16 or 17. "What kind of man is he?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Uncle Cornelius waved dismissively. "Prosperous, that's what matters. The wedding is arranged for next month. You'll want to prepare yourself properly." That evening, I sought out Marie, our elderly cook who had stayed with us despite our inability to pay proper wages. She was one of the few free people of color I knew well. Having been manumitted by my grandmother years before, Marie had a network of information that extended throughout the French Quarter and beyond. "You heard about this Mr. Blackwood?" I asked as she prepared what would be another meager dinner. Marie's weathered hands paused in their work. "Child, that man got a reputation that ain't good. His wives, they don't seem to last long on that plantation. Wives, plural. This would be his third. First one died in childbirth, they say. Second one, well, she took to laudanum something fierce before she passed. Word is he got a heavy hand and a cruel disposition." Fear settled in my stomach like a cold stone. "What choice do I have, Marie?" Uncle Cornelius made it clear this is happening whether I agree or not. Marie looked at me with eyes full of compassion and something else, a recognition of shared powerlessness that transcended the racial boundaries that normally defined our interactions. "Sometimes, Miss Catherine, we got to make our own choices when others try to make them for us. You remember that." 3 weeks later, I found myself in a carriage heading toward Blackwood Plantation, my few possessions packed in a single trunk. The landscape changed as we moved away from New Orleans, becoming more rural and isolated. Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees like tattered curtains, and the air grew thick with the scent of sugarcane and something else, something that made my skin crawl with unease. The plantation house came into view as we rounded a bend in the dirt road. It was impressive, certainly a grand white structure with imposing columns and wraparound galleries typical of Louisiana's wealthy planters, but there was something about it that felt forbidding, as if the very walls held secrets too dark to speak. Jeremiah Blackwood waited on the front steps to greet me. He was a tall man in his 40s, with graying hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to evaluate me like livestock at market. His smile was practiced but never reached his eyes. "Miss Beaumont," he said, taking my hand with a grip that was just slightly too firm, "welcome to your new home." As I stepped out of the carriage, I noticed the enslaved people working in the distance, figures moving through the cane fields under the brutal afternoon sun. Closer to the house, I saw a tall black man directing a group loading supplies. He was different from the others somehow, carrying himself with a quiet dignity that drew my attention. When he glanced toward the house, our eyes met briefly, and I saw something there: intelligence, wariness, and perhaps a flicker of sympathy. "That's Samuel," Blackwood said, noticing my gaze. "My most trusted overseer. Don't let his appearance fool you. He knows his place." There was something in Blackwood's tone that made me uncomfortable, a hint of violence barely contained beneath his genteel exterior. Samuel looked away quickly, returning to his work. But I found myself wondering about him. in a world where I was beginning to feel like property myself. There was something in his bearing that spoke of an unbroken spirit. That night, as I lay in the ornate but stifling bedroom that was now mine, I listened to the sounds of the plantation, the distant singing from the slave quarters, the rustle of night creatures in the swamp, and the heavy footsteps of my new husband pacing the gallery below. I thought of Marie's words about making my own choices, and I wondered if I would ever have the courage to do so. I had no idea that within a few short months, my life would depend on the very man I had noticed that first day, that Samuel would become not just my protector, but my pathway to a freedom I was only beginning to understand I needed. The first month at Blackwood Plantation revealed truths that chilled me more than any Louisiana winter could. I quickly learned that my husband's reputation for cruelty was not merely plantation gossip, but a grim reality that touched every soul who lived and worked on his land. Jeremiah Blackwood was methodical in his brutality. He had arbitrary rules that changed according to his moods. The enslaved people were to keep their eyes down in his presence, speak only when spoken to, and work from sunrise to well past sunset. Any perceived infraction resulted in punishment that ranged from reduced rations to the whip. Or worse, my own situation became clearer with each passing day. I was property, much like the enslaved people in the quarters. Though my cage was gilded with fine dresses and china, Blackwood expected absolute obedience from me, and when I dared to question his treatment of the workers, or suggest that perhaps the children in the fields looked too young for such labor, his demeanor would shift like a summer storm. "Catherine," he would say, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "you are my wife. Your duty is to support me, not question my methods. These people are property, investments that must be managed properly. If you cannot understand that, perhaps you need to be reminded of your own position." The first time he struck me was on a Tuesday in late June. I had asked if the elderly woman working in the kitchen might rest during the hottest part of the day. As she seemed to be struggling with the heat, his backhanded slap sent me reeling into the dining room wall, my cheek burning and my ears ringing. "Do not presume to manage my property," he said calmly, as if he had merely commented on the weather. "Your predecessor made the same mistake." It did not end well for her that night. As I sat on the gallery applying a cool cloth to my swollen face, I noticed Samuel approaching the house. He moved quietly, carrying what appeared to be ledgers for the next day's work assignments. When he saw me, he paused, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Evening, Miss Catherine," he said quietly, his voice carrying the educated accent that had surprised me since my arrival. Unlike many of the enslaved people on the plantation, Samuel spoke with the careful diction of someone who had learned to read and write. "Good evening, Samuel," I replied, then winced as the movement aggravated my injured cheek. He noticed, of course. Samuel seemed to notice everything. A survival skill that I was beginning to understand was essential in this place. "Ma'am, if you need anything for that, my grandmother knew about healing herbs." I could. "No," I said quickly, glancing toward the house. "Thank you. But no, Mr. Blackwood wouldn't approve." Samuel nodded, understanding the unspoken danger. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." But as he turned to go, he paused. "Miss Catherine, that salve you asked about for old Mamie in the kitchen, I made sure she got some willow bark tea. Helps with the pain in her joints." I looked at him in surprise. Not only had he overheard my conversation with Blackwood, but he had acted on it, despite the risk to himself. "Why would you do that?" "If Mr. Blackwood found out." Samuel's eyes met mine directly for the first time since I had arrived. "Sometimes doing right is more important than doing safe. Ma'am, my mama taught me that before she was sold away." The simple dignity in his words hit me like a physical blow. Here was a man who had every reason to think only of his own survival, yet he chose compassion. It made me ashamed of my own inaction, my acceptance of the horrors happening around me. Over the following weeks, I began to pay closer attention to Samuel's role on the plantation. He was indeed trusted by Blackwood, but I gradually realized it was a trust born of fear rather than respect. Samuel was literate, intelligent, and organized, qualities that made him invaluable as an overseer. But he was also walking a dangerous line, trying to protect the other enslaved people while avoiding Blackwood's wrath. I watched him mediate disputes, comfort children who had been separated from their parents, and quietly redistribute food to those who were being punished with reduced rations. He did all of this while maintaining the facade of the loyal slave that Blackwood expected to see. One evening in late July, As I was walking in the garden trying to escape the stifling heat of the house, I heard raised voices from the direction of the slave quarters. Blackwood's voice carried clearly in the still air. Along with the sound of his whip cutting through the humid night, I found myself moving toward the sound, drawn by a horror I couldn't name. What I saw would haunt me for the rest of my life. A young man, perhaps 17 or 18, was tied to a post while Blackwood administered what he called correction. The boy's back was already striped with blood, and still Blackwood continued, his face twisted with a pleasure that made my stomach turn. "You thought you could rest without permission," Blackwood was saying between strikes. "You thought you were too good for the work assigned to you." Samuel stood nearby, his face a mask of controlled fury. He was required to witness these punishments, to maintain order among the other enslaved people who were forced to watch. But I could see the tension in every line of his body, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. When Blackwood finally finished, the young man slumped against his bonds, barely conscious. "Samuel, see that he gets back to work tomorrow, and if he's not up to full strength, reduce his family's rations for a week." "Yes, sir," Samuel replied, his voice carefully neutral, as Blackwood walked back toward the house, whistling softly to himself. I pressed back into the shadows, sickened by what I had witnessed. But I saw Samuel approach the injured young man, speaking quietly to him as he cut the bonds. "Easy, Marcus, easy now. Let me help you." I watched as Samuel carefully supported the young man, speaking words of comfort that I couldn't quite hear. Other enslaved people emerged from the shadows to help, creating a network of care and support that existed despite Blackwood's attempts to crush their humanity. That night, I lay awake thinking about what I had seen. Not just the brutality of my husband, which was becoming harder to deny with each passing day, but the quiet resistance of Samuel and the others, the way they maintained their dignity and compassion in the face of systematic dehumanization. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Plantation, I began to understand that I was not the only one who felt trapped. The difference was that Samuel and the others had never had the illusion of choice that I had once possessed. They had been born into bondage, while I had walked into mine with my eyes wide open, driven by fear and social expectations. But perhaps it wasn't too late to open my eyes wider, to see not just my own suffering but the greater suffering around me. Perhaps it wasn't too late to choose something different, even if I didn't yet know what that choice might look like. As dawn approached and the sounds of another day began to stir from the quarters, I made a decision. I would no longer be a passive observer of the cruelty that surrounded me. Somehow, someway, I would find the courage that Samuel showed every day, the courage to do what was right, even when it wasn't safe. August brought with it a timidity so oppressive it felt like breathing underwater. And with it came a change in the delicate balance of life at Blackwood Plantation. My husband's moods had grown increasingly unpredictable, swinging from cold indifference to sudden, violent rage with no warning. The enslaved people moved through their daily routines with the careful vigilance of prey animals, and I found myself adopting the same hyper-awareness. It was during one of Blackwood's business trips to New Orleans that I first had the opportunity to speak with Samuel alone. I had been walking through the gardens in the early evening, seeking relief from the stifling house, when I encountered him checking the irrigation channels that fed water from the river to the sugarcane fields. "Miss Catherine," he said, straightening and removing his hat in the deferential gesture that all enslaved people were required to perform in the presence of white women. But there was something in his question, perhaps, or a recognition of shared circumstance. "Samuel," I replied, then glanced around nervously. "Is it safe for us to speak?" He understood immediately what I meant. "Master Blackwood won't return until tomorrow evening. His driver, Thomas, sent word from the city." We stood in awkward silence for a moment, both of us aware that we were crossing invisible but dangerous boundaries in the rigid social hierarchy of the plantation. A white woman and an enslaved man were not supposed to have conversations that weren't directly related to household business. "That night," I said finally, "when you helped Marcus after the punishment, I saw what you did." Samuel's posture tensed. "Ma'am, I was just following orders, getting him back to the quarters." "No," I said quietly, "you were being kind, you were taking care of him." I paused, gathering courage. "Just like you've been taking care of others, the extra rations, the medicine, the way you shield the children from the worst of it." He studied my face carefully, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of trap. "Miss Catherine," I don't know what you think you saw, but I think I saw a good man trying to do right in an impossible situation. I interrupted. Just like I think you see a woman who's beginning to understand that her cage has bars just like yours do. Even if they're painted gold. The honesty of my words seemed to surprise him. For a long moment, we looked at each other across the divide of race and legal status, and I saw recognition there, the acknowledgement of shared captivity. How long have you been here? I asked. Since I was 12, he replied. My mother and I were sold from a plantation in Virginia after the master died. She was sent to work in the big house, me to the fields. His voice remained steady, but I could hear the old pain in it. She died of fever 3 years later. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. She taught me to read before she died, Samuel continued, as if my simple expression of sympathy had unlocked something in him. Said knowledge was the one thing they couldn't take away from us, even if they tried. Master Blackwood found out about my education and decided it made me useful for keeping records, managing the others, and you've been walking this tightrope ever since, I observed, protecting people while trying not to anger him. Samuel nodded, slowly, every day. Some days I succeed, some days. He gestured toward the quarters, where the sounds of evening were beginning, children playing, women cooking, men returning from the fields. Some days I fail, and people suffer for it. I felt tears prick my eyes. I've been failing to, standing by, watching, telling myself there was nothing I could do. Miss Catherine, Samuel said gently. You got to understand something. In this place, just surviving is an act of resistance. Just keeping your humanity intact is a victory. His words hit me like a revelation. I had been so focused on my own fear and helplessness that I hadn't recognized the daily courage it took for everyone on this plantation to maintain their dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Over the following weeks, as summer blazed toward its peak, Samuel and I began to find ways to work together quietly. When Blackwood was away on business, which happened frequently as he expanded his holdings, I would slip extra food from the kitchen to Samuel, who would distribute it to families with children. I began to learn the names and stories of the people who lived in the quarters. Marcus, the young man who had been whipped, was supporting his sick mother and 2 younger siblings. Mamie, the elderly cook, had been separated from her own children decades ago, but had become a grandmother figure to dozens of others. I also began to understand the complex social dynamics within the enslaved community. There were those who had been born on the plantation and those who had been purchased from other places. There were those who worked in the house and those who labored in the fields. There were those who still remembered Africa through family stories and those whose families had been in America for generations. But through it all, I saw how they supported each other, how they created networks of care and protection that transcended the arbitrary divisions Blackwood tried to impose. And at the center of it all was Samuel, serving as mediator, protector, and keeper of hope. It was in early September that everything changed. Blackwood had been drinking more heavily than usual, and his temper had grown even more volatile. One evening, as I was reading in the parlor, he burst through the door with eyes full of rage. You think I don't know what you've been doing? He demanded, grabbing my arm and hauling me to my feet. My heart pounded with terror. Jeremiah, I don't know what you mean. Don't lie to me, he shouted, his grip tightening until I cried out. I've seen you watching me, judging me. I've heard you crying at night. You think you're better than me, don't you? Just like the others, his previous wives. His fist connected with my ribs, driving the breath from my lungs. As I gasped and tried to stay upright, he continued his assault, his words as violent as his blows. You're my property, Catherine, my property to do with as I please. If you can't accept that, then perhaps you need to join the others who couldn't learn their place. Through the haze of pain and terror, I understood what he was telling me. He had killed his previous wives, and he was threatening to kill me too. When he finally stopped, I was crumpled on the floor, barely conscious. He stood over me, breathing heavily, his knuckles bloody. Clean yourself up, he said coldly, and remember, if you ever cross me again, it will be the last thing you do. After he left, I lay on the floor for what felt like hours, too hurt to move, too terrified to cry. When I finally managed to drag myself upright, I caught a glimpse of movement outside the window. Samuel was there, in the shadows of the oak tree nearest the house. He had heard everything. Our eyes met through the glass, and I saw in his face the same rage I felt, the same desperate need to fight back against the monster who held us all captive. That night, as I tended my injuries with shaking hands, I knew that something fundamental had changed. The pretense of civilized marriage had been stripped away, revealing the ugly truth underneath. I was not Blackwood's wife, I was his victim, just as much as any person he owned. And for the first time since arriving at this plantation of horrors, I began to think seriously about escape, not just from my marriage, but from this entire system that treated human beings like property. The question was no longer whether I could find the courage to leave, but whether I could find a way to take others with me, because I had learned something important from Samuel and the others. In the face of systemic evil, individual survival was not enough. Sometimes, the only way to save yourself was to save others too. September brought rumors of unrest from other plantations, whispered conversations in the quarters about failed escape attempts and brutal punishments. The tension was palpable, like the electric charge in the air before a storm. Blackwood's paranoia had increased accordingly, and he had begun conducting surprise inspections of the slave quarters, searching for any sign of rebellion or plans for escape. It was during one of these searches that he discovered something that would seal all our fates: Samuel's hidden journal. I was in the garden, moving carefully due to the injuries that had still not fully healed from our last conversation, when I heard Blackwood's roar of rage from the direction of the quarters. My blood turned to ice as I recognized the particular tone, the sound he made when he discovered something that he considered a betrayal. "Samuel," he bellowed, "get out here now." I watched in horror as Samuel emerged from his small cabin, his face composed but his eyes alert to danger. In Blackwood's hands was a small leather-bound book that I had never seen before. "What is this?" Blackwood demanded, holding up the journal. "What is this filth you've been writing?" Even from a distance, I could see Samuel's jaw tighten. "It's just records, sir, keeping track of supplies, work assignments, records." Blackwood's voice rose to a shriek. "Records of what? Listen to this." He opened the book and began reading aloud. "Today, Master Blackwood whipped young David for spilling water. The boy is only 8 years old. I wonder if there is a God in heaven who sees what happens in this place, and if he does, why he allows such cruelty to continue." The words hit me like physical blows. Samuel had been documenting the horrors of plantation life, creating a record of Blackwood's crimes. It was incredibly dangerous and incredibly brave, and this, Blackwood continued, his voice dripping with venom. "Miss Catherine grows thinner each day. I can see the fear in her eyes when she looks at him. She reminds me of a bird with a broken wing, trying to fly but unable to escape the cage." Heat flooded my face as I realized Samuel had been writing about me, about my suffering. But more than embarrassment, I felt a profound sense of being seen, of being understood in my isolation. "You think you can judge me?" Blackwood snarled. "You think you can document my business like some kind of journalist?" "No, sir," Samuel replied quietly. "It was wrong of me to write such things. I apologize." But Blackwood was beyond reason now. The discovery of the journal had triggered something in him, a rage that went beyond this single transgression. "You've been watching me, haven't you? Watching and judging and thinking you're better than your master. Well, let me show you what happens to uppity slaves who forget their place." He began walking toward the punishment post, dragging Samuel behind him. But as they passed near my hiding place in the garden, Samuel's eyes found mine. What I saw there was not defeat, but determination. He mouthed a single word: "Tonight." The whipping that followed was the most brutal I had ever witnessed. Blackwood seemed determined to break Samuel completely, to strip away the dignity that had always set him apart. But even as the whip fell again and again, Samuel never cried out, never begged for mercy. He endured it with the same quiet strength he showed in everything else. When it was over, Blackwood turned to address the gathered enslaved people. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. This is what happens when you forget your place, and tomorrow, Samuel will be sold. I'm done with his insubordination." Sold. The word hit me like a physical blow. Samuel would be taken away, probably to an even worse situation, and I would be left alone with Blackwood's increasing violence and madness. That night, as the plantation settled into uneasy sleep, I sat by my window watching the quarters. Near midnight, I saw a figure moving carefully between the cabins. Samuel, despite his injuries, was saying goodbye. I made my decision. Wrapping a shawl around my shoulders, I slipped out of the house and made my way toward the quarters. I found Samuel near the edge of the swamp, where he was speaking quietly with several other enslaved people. "Samuel," I whispered, and they all turned in alarm. "Miss Catherine," he said, struggling to stand despite his injuries. You shouldn't be here if Master Blackwood is dead drunk, I interrupted. And I'm not going back to that house. Not tonight, not ever. The others looked at me with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. It was Marcus, the young man Samuel had helped after his own whipping, who spoke first. Ma'am, with respect, you don't understand what you're saying. If you're caught out here, with us, I'll be punished, just like you would be, I said firmly. The only difference is that my cage has better furnishings. Samuel studied my face in the moonlight. Catherine, what are you saying? I'm saying I want to go with you, wherever you're going, however you're getting there. I want to go to. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fears and possibilities. Finally, Samuel spoke. There's a network, he said quietly, people who help slaves escape to the north. But it's dangerous, and there are no guarantees. If we're caught, we'll be no worse off than we are now. I replied, Samuel, he's going to kill me, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually, just like he killed the others. Samuel nodded slowly. I know, I've seen the signs. Then we help each other. I said, you know the land, the waterways. I have money hidden in my room, jewelry we can sell for passage. Together, we might have a chance. Marcus looked between us uncertainly. Samuel, if she comes with us, it changes everything. They'll hunt us harder. A white woman traveling with escaped slaves. I know, Samuel replied, but she's right. We're stronger together than apart. The next few hours were a blur of careful preparation, while Samuel and the others gathered supplies and made contact with their underground network. I returned to the house to collect what I could. Hidden in my jewelry box was a small fortune, in gems and gold that had belonged to my mother Adams. Blackwood didn't know existed. As dawn approached, our small group gathered at the edge of the swamp. Besides Samuel and myself, there was Marcus and his younger sister Sarah, who was only 14 but had been marked for sale to a brothel in New Orleans. The thought of what awaited her, if we failed, gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. From here on, Samuel said, looking at each of us in turn, we're not master and slave, not white and black, we're just people trying to get free. We take care of each other, and we don't leave anyone behind. As we waded into the dark water of the bayou, beginning our journey toward an uncertain freedom, I thought about the woman I had been when I first arrived at Blackwood Plantation, naive, privileged, blind to the suffering around me. That woman was gone, left behind in a house that had become a prison. The woman who moved through the swamp water beside Samuel was someone new, someone who understood that true freedom meant not just escaping your own chains, but helping to break the chains that bound others. Someone who had learned that sometimes the most unexpected alliances are forged in the crucible of shared suffering and mutual respect. Ahead of us lay hundreds of miles of dangerous territory, bounty hunters, and the constant threat of recapture. Behind us was a world built on the brutal subjugation of human beings. A world that would not let us go without a fight. But beside me was Samuel, whose quiet strength had sustained so many for so long, and whose courage had finally given me the strength to choose freedom over safety. Together, we faced the unknown, bound not by the legal ties of marriage or ownership, but by something far stronger, the recognition of each other's fundamental humanity and the shared determination to protect it at all costs. Our story was far from over, but for the first time since I had arrived in Louisiana, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed: hope.